Artistic Audio presents Peter Pan.
Michael Darling couldn't sleep. Not surprising, really, because his big sister Wendy had just told him a wonderful story about a land filled with pirates, mermaids, and great adventures, and it was all too exciting. "Michael," whispered Wendy, "if you don't go to sleep, you'll be tired in the morning." "Oh, I wish I could," said Michael, "but there are crocs all over the carpet." Their brother John had been woken by their talking. "Michael, there are no pirates and no crocodiles." Just then, all three children froze in their beds because they could hear a sniffing noise. "Look," whispered Wendy, pointing to the rug in the middle of the room. And there sat a small boy dressed in leaves and cobwebs, and he was crying. Being a thoughtful girl, Wendy got out of bed and put her hand on the boy's shoulder. "Whatever is the matter?" she asked quietly. The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve, and without looking up, he replied, "Can't get my shadow to stick back on." "Your shadow?" said Wendy. "Yes," said the boy, looking up. "Why shouldn't I? It's my shadow after all." Wendy found herself agreeing with him. She could see in the half moonlight that the boy was around her age and with a mop of mousy hair. "Well, I suppose I could try sewing your shadow back on," said Wendy. "Well, might work better than soap," said the boy hopefully. "Wait there," said Wendy, fetching her sewing kit. And when it was done, the boy's mood changed instantly. "There," he said proudly. "How extremely clever I am." Wendy was a bit confused by this, as the sewing had been her idea. But before she could say another word, she was distracted by a tinkling sound and a floating light in the centre of the room. She looked closer and was surprised to see a tiny girl with golden wings, no larger than a hummingbird and just as beautiful. Young Michael lost all fear in an instant. Jumping out of bed and holding out his hand, "It's a fairy, Wendy, look!" "Of course it is," said the boy. "It's Tinker Bell. And I'm Peter Pan." Wendy was lost for words. The name sounded familiar. "I'm John Darling," said John, "and this is my little brother Michael, and that's Wendy." Peter smiled. Tinker Bell gave a tiny nod. "How old are you, Peter Pan?" said Wendy. "Dunno," Peter replied, scratching his chin. "Quite young, I think." "I'm 6, said Michael proudly. Peter looked Michael up and down and then declared, "Well, I'm older than that." "Why don't you know your age?" asked John. Peter shrugged. "Never needed to." "So," said Peter, looking at Wendy, "want to come with me to Neverland? I live there with my gang, the Lost Boys. I'm the leader and no grown-ups are allowed on the island." "No grown-ups?" said Michael excitedly. "On the island?" said John. "Yep, in the middle of a clear blue ocean. There are amazing adventures and treacherous pirates, but don't worry, I'm smarter than they are." Michael's eyes lit up. "Pirates?" Wendy shook her head. "Well, it all sounds rather silly if you ask me. I mean, how on earth would we even get to this place?" "We fly," said Peter. He grabbed hold of Tinker Bell and shook golden dust from her wings all over Wendy, Michael and John. And in an instant the children's feet left the floor and they began to float. Peter went to the window, opened it, and then flew right outside. "You just need a spot of fairy dust and to believe that you can." Well, being children with great imaginations, they did believe, and so one by one they flew out of their nursery window and into the fresh night air, 3 floors up. "This is amazing," shouted John. "I flewed," said Michael, turning over and over in an endless somersault. "Careful, Michael, or you'll be quite sick," said Wendy sensibly. But even she was grinning from ear to ear. "Let's go," shouted Peter. "Second star to the right and straight on till morning." He kicked his heels and soared high into the air above the streets of London. Wendy couldn't quite believe what was happening, but she knew one thing. This was the most exciting thing she had ever done. In no time at all, Peter, Tinkerbell, and the Darling children were soaring through the blazing blue skies of Neverland. It was exactly as Peter had described it. The ocean below was dotted with islands strewn with palm trees and sand. Peter flew them down to the smallest island, where they all landed in an explosion of sand and excitement. Poof! "Amazing!" exclaimed Michael. "Did you see the pirate ships, John? Real pirates!" John nodded, a huge grin on his face. "I'm not scared of them," said Peter, boasting. "I beat Captain Hook, and I'll beat him again, easy." "Captain Hook?" asked John. Peter laughed. "Yeah, he wears a hook after I cut his hand off in a sword fight." "Oh, that's horrible," said Wendy with a look of disgust. "Whoa, did he ever find it?" asked John. "Nope," said Peter, smiling. "Funny thing is, it got gobbled up by a crocodile." Wendy frowned. "I'm not sure if that's funny exactly." "It is, though," said Peter, doubling over with laughter, "because that crocodile has been chasing him ever since. He liked the taste of his hand so much he wants to eat the rest." Peter and John were now rolling about on the sand in fits of giggles, and Michael was even joining in, although he didn't really know what they were laughing about. "Plus, the crocodile who wants to eat Hook wants an alarm clock," added Peter. "So if a Hook ever hears that tick-tock, he starts sweating and scurries off like a little wimp." Wendy shook her head and tutted. "Well, that's just mean. Why don't you boys grow up?" But at that, Peter stopped laughing suddenly and stared at Wendy. "No," he shouted. "I will never grow up. And if that's what you want, you're not welcome here." The laughing stopped. Peter's sudden anger had been a shock, and Michael hid behind his brother for safety. Thankfully, just at that moment, 6 little faces appeared, staring out from between the palm trees. "Oh, these are the Lost Boys," said Peter, as if nothing had happened. "They fell out of their prams when their nannies weren't looking, and now they live with me." Curly, a tiny boy with a shock of curly black hair, stepped from the tree and pointed at Wendy. "Who's that?" he asked. Peter puffed out his chest and said proudly, "Boys, I have brought you a Wendy. She'll be your mother." The Lost Boys cheered, but Wendy was a little confused. She didn't remember agreeing to that. "This is Curly, Tootles, Nibs, Slightly, and the twins," said Peter. They were a funny-looking bunch, scruffy and ragtag, but they all smiled and waved. "I'm hungry," said Peter. "Let's eat." And off he ran into the tree line, followed closely by the Lost Boys and Tinkerbell. The next day, after a long night's sleep in their underground hideaway, the Lost Boys showed Michael and John around the island, while Peter and Tinkerbell took Wendy to visit the mermaids at Maruna's Rock. It had been quite an adventure, and they arrived back at the camp that night with a young girl called Tiger Lily. Peter had saved her from the pirates who had tied her to a rock. "These pirates are awful," said Wendy. "Not all pirates are, though, are they?" asked Michael hopefully. Said Peter, frowning. "Hook's after me. I just know it." Wendy shook her head. Peter had a curious way of making everything about him. She turned to Tiger Lily to try and cheer her up. "Your parents must be so worried," said Wendy, hugging the poor thing. It made her miss her own mother and father, and she felt a sudden pang of sadness. Over the next week, Peter and the darling children had many scary adventures, and Wendy was starting to feel that Neverland was a rather dangerous place. One night she spoke to John and Michael about how she was feeling homesick. "I do miss our mother and father, and our dog Nana too." "I miss them too," said Michael sadly, "and my toys." John agreed. "But Wendy," he said quietly, "how will we ever tell Peter that we want to leave?" There was a voice from the doorway. "No need." It was Peter, standing with his arms and his eyebrows firmly crossed. Tinkerbell sat happily on his shoulder. "Sorry, Peter," said Wendy. "I know you're upset, but I'm not upset. So what if you want to see your stupid parents? Things were much more fun before you got here." Tinkerbell nodded and smiled. Just then, the faces of the Lost Boys and Tiger Lily appeared at the door. They had been listening too. "I miss my mum," said Tiger Lily sadly. "I don't remember mine," said Tootles. "I don't either," said Nibs. "But I think I would miss your mum, Wendy." "Me too," added Curly, "and I never even met her." "Wendy, do you think we could come home with you?" asked Slightly. "Oh yes," said Curly. "They could be our parents too." The Lost Boys looked at Wendy excitedly. "Really?" said Wendy. "You'd all like to come?" They nodded, apart from Peter Pan, who simply shook his head in anger and flew up into the night without another word. Tinkerbell watched him leave and then went up to her own treetop bed, quite relieved that Wendy would soon be gone. The Lost Boys were so happy when Wendy told them that her parents would probably adopt them all, and then she did the motherly thing of telling them it was very late and they should probably all settle down to get some rest. A little while later, Wendy was woken up by a noise and sat straight up in her leafy bed. "Peter, is that you?" she said softly so as not to wake anyone else. But Peter didn't reply. Wendy listened carefully, but all she could hear was the distant rush of the ocean. Seconds later, the pirates appeared, led by Smee, Captain Hook's first mate. They grabbed the children from their beds, quickly bound their hands and feet so they couldn't fly away, and sailed off into the night. "Good thing Peter's not here," thought Wendy. "At least there's someone who can come and save us." Minutes later, Peter was woken by Tinkerbell, who had watched from the treetops as the pirates attacked the camp. She had flown as fast as she could to tell Peter Pan that Wendy, her brothers, and the Lost Boys had all been captured. "Let's go, Tink," said Peter, with a glint in his eye. "We've got a date with old Captain Hook. Maybe I'll lop his other hand off too." Captain Hook was pacing the deck. He thought that Peter Pan had been poisoned, and the Lost Boys would soon be walking the plank along with the bossy Wendy girl and her two foolish brothers. The boys were all lined up on deck, and Wendy was tied to the mast. "Right, Lost Boys," said Hook, "you have a choice. Join my crew as a pirate and spend your life being dastardly, or walk the plank and be eaten by crocodiles." The Lost Boys stared back, not knowing what to say. "Well, what'll it be?" shouted Hook. "I refuse," shouted John. "I refuse too," shouted Michael, copying his brother, secretly wishing he could try pirating just for a short while. None of the other boys spoke a word. "Very well," said Hook calmly. In that case... Rule Britannia! Shouted Curly suddenly. In that case, Hook continued, ignoring Curly's outburst completely, you shall all walk the plank. Hook froze, for there it was, the unmistakable tick-tock, tick-tock of a clock that had been swallowed by a crocodile. Hook turned white as a sheet and scampered off like a rat to hide in his cabin. Hide me, Smee, hide me, he whimpered. But this terrifying tick-tocking came from no crocodile. It was Peter Pan, who'd had the brilliant idea to scare the captain, and it had worked. In all the confusion, Peter had managed to throw 2 pirates overboard before anyone knew what was happening. And the rest of Hook's crew were running back and forth. A few even threw themselves overboard instead of fighting the dreaded Peter Pan. Peter cut the Lost Boys' ropes and set Wendy free from the mast, and they all piled into the fight, stealing swords and daggers as they went. Without Hook to lead them, the pirates were driven into the perilous ocean in no time. Hook crept out of hiding to discover that every single one of his men were gone, and he was surrounded by angry children. Terrifying thought for anyone. Put up your swords, boys, said Peter with a smile. This man is mine. They both fought expertly, their blades clashing as they lunged and parried across the deck. But Hook was no match for Peter Pan, and with a final flurry of swordsmanship, Peter cut, swerved, and attacked, and Captain Hook fell over the side to the hungry crocodiles below, and was gone. After much celebration, Peter Pan agreed to fly the Darling Children and the Lost Boys back to London. Wendy, Michael, and John arrived home and slipped inside their beds, to be found by their mother just before lights out. Mr. and Mrs. Darling was so happy that their children had returned home that they were not cross at all. But what of the Lost Boys? If you remember, they were desperately hoping that Wendy's parents would adopt them all on the spot. Well, that is what happened. Yes, it was a bit of a squeeze in that house, but they all managed to fit in quite nicely. Wendy's mother did ask Peter Pan if he would like to be adopted too, but he refused. He wasn't interested if it meant having to grow up. Instead, agreeing to visit once a year on the first day of spring. For the next few years, Wendy was so excited as she waited for that special day, but when it came, it always made her feel sad. Some years Peter would come, and some years he wouldn't. And Wendy grew older and wiser, and had many other things to fill her mind. Then, one spring evening, many years later, Wendy had just tucked her own daughter into bed in the very same nursery that she had slept in all those years before. And there he was, Peter Pan, standing on that rug in the middle of the room. But he was still a young boy with his baby teeth and a mop of mousy hair. And here was Wendy, all grown up with a child of her own. "Hello, Wendy, darling," said Peter. "Where are Michael and John?" "I'm not here anymore, Peter," replied Wendy. There was a pause. "Peter, are you expecting me to go with you to Neverland?" "Of course," said Peter. And Wendy shed a tiny tear for the boy she used to know and for the girl she used to be. When Wendy's daughter grew up, it was her daughter who would be visited by Peter Pan, and then her granddaughter after that, and so on and so on. Of course, there was no knowing if or when he might turn up at all, but one thing is for certain, a as sure as the summer sun is hot. Peter Pan.